Hello, bruvs. Back with Buried Alive. Get this over here so I can ban people. Buried Alive. The terrifying history of our most primal fear. Is this light on? No. Now it's on. Put this candle over here and start reading. Where's the chat? So I can ban morons. Thank you. Buried Alive, Chapter 10. Where is my weight? Literary premature burials. How had I fallen into a chasm that closed its dark, inevitable arms and crushed me, bruised and blind? I struck and beat with bleeding strength in vain. 100 hands fought in the gloom with mine, as water weak at every step there stirred some hissing snake. I felt as one that's bound and buried alive, the black, dank death mold stamped down overhead. And cried, but no help came. Gerald Massey, only a dream. The earliest literary use of the premature burial theme follows a familiar theme, that of the young lady who is accidentally buried alive, but saved by her lover. In his Decameron, I don't know how to say that, written in the 1350s, Giovanni Boccaccio describes the attempts of a lecher named Messer Gentile da Carisenda to seduce Caterina, the beautiful wife of a gentleman named Nicoluccio Caccianemico Baba, but he is not given any encouragement by her. She dies sometime later, and Gentile decides to visit the tomb to steal some innocent kisses. What a sick bastard. I'm gonna go kiss this corpse. He reasons that now, when she is dead, she can no longer resist his advances. He breaks into the vault and takes liberties with the cold, still corpse. Some days later, he comes back to touch her breasts. What? That's what that book's about. He is thus employed for some considerable time when he suddenly detects that her heart is still beating. Gentile stops his necrophilic activities and rushes her back to his mother's house. The virtuous lady recovers from her death trance and is later reunited with her husband. Another of Boccaccio's more risque tales also deals with the misadventures of a living corpse. A clever abbot wants to seduce the wife of a stupid wealthy farmer named Ferrando, but the farmer knows his wife's flighty disposition and guards her jealously. The abbot then deliberately poisons Ferrando with a powder that put him into a deep trance. He is declared dead and buried in a vault, but the abbot clandestinely kidnaps his lifeless body and brings in to a torture chamber where the luckless farmer is whipped and tortured to make him believe that he is in purgatory for the great sin of being too jealous. The abbot and Ferrando's wife pass the time very agreeably together until the wife becomes pregnant. The abbot then again poisons Ferrando with his drug, puts him back into the vault, and has him rescued from his premature tomb the next day. At first, everybody thinks that he is a ghost, but Ferrando explains that he was in purgatory and that God spared his life after he promised never to doubt his wife's virtue again. The abbot and Ferrando's wayward wife later met together as often as they conveniently could, making themselves very merry at the stupidity of the husband. The 16th century author Matteo Bandello also used the theme of the lady buried alive in one of his novels, but while the hero of Boccaccio's tale has been a lecherous fellow, Bandello's two young lovers are pure, innocent teenagers. Gerardo and Helene are children of two wealthy Venetian burghers. whose palace face each other across the Grand Canal. After the death of Helene's mother, she is brought up by a wet nurse who aids and abets the two young lovers. She even secretly marries them in a mock ceremony, kneeling in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary. But then things go badly wrong for Gerardo and Helene. He is sent abroad to take care of his family's business, and her father decides that she is to be married to a certain gentleman without consulting her wishes on the subject. Poor Helene falls into a decline when she hears this disastrous news. The day before her wedding, the lethargy deepens, and a doctor declares her dead from a subtle catarrh that has traveled from the head to the heart. She is buried in the family vault. The same evening, the distraught Gerardo goes to see her one final time. He finds her alive and takes her to his mother's house, where she is nursed back to health. Her presumptive husband challenges Gerardo to a duel when he finds out that his wife is still alive. But the matter is put before the magistrates of Venice. The ubiquitous wet nurse appears, however, to tell them about the secret marriage, and all ends happily. Bandello was probably inspired by an earlier variant of the story by his fellow Italian Luigi di Porto, but there were several other variants. One of them, the sad tale of Romeo and Juliet, that was adapted by William Shakespeare. What is likely to be the earliest premature burial scene in English literature takes place in Thomas Amory's John Buncle. In this long and slightly ridiculous novel, the passionate Buncle wanders through the dangerous moors and mountains of northern England, where he encounters various beautiful and talented women, all of whom he marries. What? After successive accidental deaths. The narrative is generously interspersed with eloquent digressions on religious and literary subjects and Rabelaisian descriptions of excessive eating and drinking. After the death of Miss Spence, who is felicitously described as having the head of Aristotle, the heart of a primitive Christian, and the form of Venus de Medici, with whom Buncle had discussed calculus after dinner, he looks for yet another wife. He abducts Miss Agnes Dunk, the daughter of a wealthy miser, and she agrees to marry him. Just a few days after the wedding, she dies of a fever, and the grieving Buncle buries her after keeping the body 7 days above ground. A certain Dr. Stanville rifles the tomb and steals the body, which he wants to use for anatomical research. But when the anatomist's knife scratches her at the beginning of the linea alba, as Buncle tactfully expresses it, Miss Agnes awakes. She is nursed back to health by the amorous doctor, who later marries her. John Buncle is not a little surprised when he meets his dead wife in the guise of Mrs. Stanville. It is characteristic of his jolly, carefree attitude that he has no qualms of conscience for having buried her alive. Instead, he edifies the reader with a short discourse about the risks of premature burial. John Buncle was published in 1756, a few years after Bruyère's book on the uncertainty of the signs of death had appeared in English translation, and some of the cases given by Amory are clearly repeated from this popular and widely read book. In the late 18th century Gothic novel, premature burial was not infrequently used as a literary motif. In Mrs. Shaw's The Restless Matron, a lady is deliberately buried alive by her wicked husband. She thus recounted her plight to the novel's heroine. It was midnight. I heard the clock strike 12. I opened my eyes and raised my hand. The impenetrable darkness I was in terrified me. I raised myself up and looked around me. I was in a shroud, a coffin, that was placed in the midst of innumerable others, was my bed. A silver lamp that afforded a faint glimmering of light was suspended by a chain in the midst of the vault. I was buried alive. This account was too dreadful for Agnes's weak spirits to bear. She gave a faint scream, and sinking back upon the couch, fainted. As could be expected, the premature burial theme also shows up in German 18th century literature. The sentimental novelist Jean Paul Richter, who had quite a large following during this time, was one of the first to let a character fall victim to the uncertainty of the signs of death. In his novel Cy Benkes, published in 1796, the main character, a young lawyer, plays dead to get away from his wife. The doctor is completely fooled by this simple trick, and Herr Sabankis is declared dead, put in a coffin, and buried, to be dug up and rescued by a friend in in the next chapter. There were quite a few other sentimental German stories about apparently dead people being rescued by philanthropists, many of them published in the 1790s or early 1800s. Poetry treated this subject as well. The popular collection Das Knaben Wanderhorn contains a very sentimental poem entitled Der Scheintod, about some children walking to the churchyard to put some flowers on the grave of their mother, who had recently died during pregnancy. They are mystified to hear noises emanating from her 9-day-old grave, not screams of horror or the scratching of broken fingernails, but a clear voice singing a lullaby. The children run home to tell their father, and he comes with them to the great churchyard and also hears the voice. In a frenzy, he drags the gravestone away and breaks the coffin open. Inside is his wife, alive and well, holding a smiling infant she had given birth to underground. The buried alive theme was also appears in the Scandinavian. The buried alive theme also appears in the Scandinavian literature. Probably the first to use it was the Danish poet Adam Oehlenschläger, who wrote a short story entitled Reichmuth von Adocht after visiting Cologne in 1813. The writer with the most premature burials per page must be Edgar Allan Poe, whose unwholesome fascination with this subject is apparent to every devotee of his horror stories. It has been questioned whether he himself lived in fear of being buried alive or merely wanted to use a well known and horrific subject to curdle the blood of his readers. In the 1830s and 1840s, it was neither uncommon nor abnormal to be concerned about the risk of being buried alive. Indeed, some of the leading European medical authorities on the subject were of the opinion that live burials were common. The popular newspapers and magazines like Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, The Casket, the Southern Literary Messenger, and the New York Mirror frequently published stories of premature internment, some of them plainly fictional, others claiming a factual origin. It is likely that these tales provided Poe with his background reading on the subject, particularly as his various editorial positions required him to keep abreast of periodical writing. In Poe's story, The Premature Burial, the narrator lists some instances of premature interments to persuade the reader that this phenomenon is a dreadful reality. One of them is a garbled version of the two young lovers legend, telling how Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade is reunited with her lover, the poor literature Julien Bousset, after he has opened her tomb to cut off some curls of her hair. The story is said to have occurred in Paris in 1810, but the ending is the traditional one. Her wicked bunker husband recognizes her, and the case is brought before a judicial tribunal. It has been shown that Poe must have read the tale of Mademoiselle Lafourcade in a Philadelphia periodical. The second story is about the Englishman Edward Stapleton, who is buried alive while in a state of trance, but rescued by body snatchers, who bring his body to a private laboratory. Before dissection, they decide to bring his body. Before dissection, they decide to stimulate the corpse with a galvanic battery, and Stapleton awakens from his trance. This story is derived from an article in Blackwood's magazine, and the name Edward Stapleton is probably Poe's own invention. Poe's third factual instance is a horrific one and brilliantly described. The wife of an eminent citizen in Baltimore was buried in the family vault. 3 years later, the vault is reopened, but when the husband swings the door open, the skeleton of his wife, dressed in her shroud, falls rattling into his arms. She had broken out of her coffin, but been unable to break through the vault door. She died a second death leaning toward it. And after her shroud became entangled in some ironwork, rotted in an erect position. This tale can also be traced to a fictional story published in the Southern Literary Messenger of 1837, 6 months after Poe left an editorial position with this magazine. It is instructive that while the lesser writer, a certain James F. Otis, describes in lurid detail how the wretched woman tears off her shroud and screams in agony during the desperate struggle, Poe leaves it to the reader's imagination to supply the minutiae of what occurred in the vault. The protagonist of Poe's The Premature Burial is a young man who suffers from a strange neurological disease which makes him prone to epileptic seizures, after which he opens lapses into a state of deep lethargy. He is an avid reader of books about apparently dead people awakening in the tomb and suffering the most dreadful tortures. As a precaution, he buys a security coffin, and he always carries with him written instructions that he is under no circumstances to be hastily buried should he suddenly collapse in the street. The famous illustration for Poe's The Premature Burial by Harry Clark. Where's the corpse? Oh, there he is. I was like, where the hell's the corpse? He's looking. Poe may have read an article in the Columbian Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine about a luxurious life preserving coffin exhibited at the American Institute in New York. Intended for vault burials, it was equipped with springs and levers on the inside, which would make the lid fly open at the slightest movement of its occupant. The conclusion of the story is that he awakes in absolute darkness, lying in a musty smelling narrow area, surrounded with wooden walls. His jaws are bound up like those of a corpse. With horror, he understands that he has been buried alive. In vain, he searches for his safety equipment inside the coffin, but he finds nothing except the unyielding walls of his narrow house. He realizes that he must have been buried by strangers and nailed up in some common coffin and thrust deep, deep, and forever into some ordinary and nameless grave. His wild cry of terror and anguish is heard by some sailors, however, and it turns out that he has really been lying in a narrow bunk on board a trawler. The musty smell came from the ship's cargo, and the cloth around his jaws was his own necktie, which he had been using as a nightcap. This nightmare experience made him forget his fears of being prematurely buried and transformed him into a saner and healthier man. He burned his medical books on the uncertainty of the signs of death and read no night thoughts, no fustian or fustian about churchyards, no bugaboo tales such as this. The Premature Burial is not one of Poe's better stories. It is marred by the contrast between the rising tension of the story and the tongue-in-cheek quality of the ludicrous ending. This did not prevent it from being taken seriously by at least one credulous American magazine writer on premature burial, who quoted its case reports with approval. The Premature Burial is by no means the only one of Poe's tales that used the theme of a premature burial. In the cask of Amontillado, the wretched Fortunato is deliberately walled in by his enemy, Montresor, and the black cat accidentally suffers the same fate, only to make its presence in the premature tomb known by a ghostly caterwauling. In several of his stories, like Morella and Ligia, the female protagonists supposedly die from diffuse nervous afflictions, but return from the tomb in the fall of the House of Usher. Lady Madeline Usher dies from an obscure cataleptic disorder. Her brother Roderick does not want her to be hastily buried in a remote churchyard, but orders to have her coffin entombed in a deep underground vault. She revives from her trance, however, breaks out of the vault, and reappears like the angel of death to reclaim her wretched brother. It is left undecided whether Roderick knew all the time that his sister was buried alive and exactly what the relation had been between these two siblings living alone in their rambling castle. Lady Madeline's return from the tomb is an event quite different from the rescue of the passive Sleeping Beauty in The Lady with the Ring, or Two Young Lovers legends. She breaks out of the vault by using brute force and returns to haunt the man who consigned her to the grave. This is reminiscent of another popular tale, which can be found in no more than one 19th century French book on premature burial, that of the termagant wife escaping from the tomb. The original story is about a meek French clerk bullied by his strong, forceful wife. One day the wife dies, so it is believed, and the pallbearers carry her coffin away to the funeral, but they drop the coffin while negotiating a narrow street corner, and the wife revives. Furious, she walks back home in her shroud and scolds the wretched husband for consigning her to a premature tomb. When the wife really dies, some years later, the husband tells the pallbearers, I implore you, messieurs, be very careful when turning corners. It is also possible to reinterpret another of Poe's more powerful stories, Berenice, by means of knowledge about the old European legends on premature burial, which had been assimilated into 19th century magazine and newspaper fiction. Aegis, the narrator, is a sad, bookish loner who lives in his own fantasy world. He suffers from an obscure species of monomania, which makes him intensely interested in observing and contemplating the most ordinary objects. For example, he might spend an inordinate time examining some detail in the typography of a book. The only other living member of Aegis's family is his cousin Berenice. Once she was a gay, vivacious girl, but a variety of severe maladies, among them a kind of epilepsy that might terminate in a death-like trance, have left her a frail invalid. One day the gloomy Aegis contemplates Berenice's emaciated frame and wasted beauty. He becomes morbidly fascinated with the spectacle of her teeth and thinks of them night and day. The symbolism of this is unclear, but it has been speculated that the teeth represent the incorruptible part of Berenice's face, which will remain unchanged even long after death. 2 days later, Aegis's servants tell him that Berenice has died and she is buried the same night. In the final scene, Aegis sits reading in his library when a servant comes in to tell him of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. The obtuse Aegis does not immediately react to this compelling announcement, but calmly remains seated in his reading chair. The horrified servant then points to Aegis's muddy clothes, stained with gore, his hand indented with the impress of human nails, and a spade that has been left standing against the wall. Aegis gives a shriek and grabs a little box on the table beside him. It falls and breaks into pieces, and he sees some instruments of dental surgery intermingled with 32 small white and ivory looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. The demented Aegis had gone to Berenice's grave, dug up the coffin, and forcibly extracted all her teeth. It had not deterred him that his cousin had awakened from her trance during this diabolical dentistry. If Berenice is the lady with the ring, Aegis is the grave robber who mutilates her. Or rather, from the motives that drive him to his perverted actions, the lecherous monk. Several versions of the former story were current in the contemporary magazine fiction, but their happy endings with the lady safely returned to her doting husband are in sharp contrast to Poe's morbid, blood spattered fantasy. An illustration for Poe's Berenice by the German artist Alfred Caben. Edgar Allan Poe's obsession with premature burial was mirrored, although in a distinctly strange manner, in the eccentric literary productions of the learned German lady Friederike Kempner. The daughter of a wealthy Jewish landowner, she enjoyed a privileged upbringing and could study the German classics without any thought of one day having to earn her living. At an early age, she had chanced to read a horrid pamphlet about premature burial, and this experience marked her for life. In 1853, when she was just 17 years old, she wrote a pamphlet or Denkschrift of her own, containing a passionate appeal to the German states to build waiting mortuaries to save the apparently dead citizens from the perils of a premature burial. She boldly claimed that a person could be in a state of trance for 20 days without any signs of putrefaction, and that listening to the heart with a stethoscope was completely useless, since an individual in a death trance could lack an audible heartbeat. Nor had she any scruples about giving the most lurid case reports, which were mainly unreferenced and unverified, in the true tradition of the anti premature burial propagandist. Amazingly enough, she even abstracted the examples from Poe's The Premature Burial and presented them as true instances of premature internment. Another example came from closer to home. When a grave was dug in the cemetery of Prosenitz in Mauren, a coffin was found to contain a still not decomposed corpse in a horrible, unnatural position, with the teeth sunk into the upper arm. It was the body of a postmistress who had been hastily buried a few years earlier. The prematurely buried woman's doctor blamed himself so much for this horrid disaster that the same night he himself died of the cholera. Another of Frederick's most pleasant stories concerns a noble countess who was buried in a vault situated directly under a church. After the funeral, a knocking sound could be clearly heard coming from inside the vault. The verger thought it was a ghost, and the parson shut the church doors and forbade him to tell anyone, since the church might receive complaints if mistakes like this one were not left underground. The horrid sound continued for 7 days, but then ceased, to the relief of the inhuman parson. When the vault was opened many years later, a skeleton was found on its stairs, and the countess's coffin was empty. Here is a sample of Frederick's overblown tirades. Is there a more horrific, more hopeless fate than that of being buried alive? The person who awakes in the coffin has been repudiated underground by his own fellow beings. The immeasurable, terrifying scourge of humanity must finally be conquered, and no more of our people fall victim to the most hideous, desperate fate. The horrid struggle in the coffin. This is a misery that lacks a name, since it is mute. The groans of its hapless victims underground can neither be heard nor seen. In spite of its gruesome subject and linguistic oddities, Frederick Kempner's Denkschrift became quite a bestseller. In 1857, its proud author could announce the fifth revised edition, which was translated into Swedish the same year. By this time, Frederick had followed Hufeland's noble example. She had personally supervised the erection of a lichen house on the family estate. She sent free copies of her pamphlet to many princes and magnates all over Europe, and some of them, like Duke Eugene of Württemberg, Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia, and Emperor Napoleon III of France sent her letters of approval for her humanitarian zeal. Countess Humika built a waiting mortuary on her estate in Posen after reading the Denkschrift. Prince Anatole Demidov had the Denkschrift translated into French and also built a waiting mortuary on his estates in Geneva. Frederick Kempner directed a steady bombardment of letters, poems, and gruesome case reports toward King Wilhelm of Prussia, who was kind enough sometimes to reply to her missives. At the onset of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, she requested permission from her royal correspondent to be allowed to come to the battle in order to examine the corpses of the brave German soldiers to make sure they were really dead before they were buried. This humanitarian mission was not allowed, however, although the patriotic Frederique stated that she had no similar qualms about prematurely buried French soldiers. She had to be content with creating a military hospital on her estate, in which she personally cared for the wounded. In between her duties as a nurse, she still found time to warn King Wilhelm about the risk of his brave warriors being buried alive. Among her missives was a ludicrous poem, "In the Germans' races, fight for land to live in. These pale, heroic faces of the dead may still be living. Great Emperor, with France enslaved, remember that it's surely a dismal end to soldiers brave to be buried prematurely." In March 1871, maybe as a result of Frederick Kempner's agitation, the newly crowned Emperor Wilhelm I mandated an obligatory 5-day waiting period between the time of death and burial in the entire German Empire. Although her interest in Although her interest in premature burial and Leichenhauser was a lifelong one, the learned lady now aimed some of her philanthropic activities at other injustices. She campaigned against solitary confinement of prisoners, anti-Semitism, and vivisection. The success of the Denkschrift went to her head, and Friederike Kempner began to fancy herself a celebrated author and poetess, a stockily built, prim spinster who bore some resemblance to an elderly Queen Victoria, already in her 30s. She was a prolific writer of pathetic, overblown poems, which she herself considered equal to the works of Schiller and Goethe. She had little sense of either grammar or meter, and an almost uncanny ability to just miss the mark in a poem, or to break the tone at the last moment. She published her poems privately, but solicited reviews with characteristic determination, sending books to crowned heads all over Europe, as well as to influential newspapers and literary critics. One of the latter, the editor Paul Lindau, was amused by Frederick's linguistic equilibristics and recommended her poems highly, although other critics complained that she brutalized their noble Teutonic mother tongue. The reading public found her poems exquisitely funny. She often returned to her own pet subject of premature burial, as in Der Scheintod. And he slept and slept so long that nothing could make him come round. Frederick Kempner. But when buried with flowers and song, the corpse stretched himself underground. Another favorite was the prematurely buried child, in which the stirring outcry of the agitated soldier, which so efficiently dispels the graveyard gloom induced by the earlier stanza, echoes Frederick's own interest in burial reform. A black and cloudy night, the graveyard's dark and still. Under earth and out of sight, a coffined child awakes and gathers his weak will. He tears the shroud and hood with fingers black and blue. He fumbles but just would for every move he makes. Mummy, where are you? His bloody hands they knock unyielding coffin walls, half dead with fright and shock. Here I am not dead, but no one heeds his call. Will I live forever in here? Ach, God, just bring a light. Farewell now, mother dear. With a final shudder of dread, he faints from pain and fright. In his coffin, all alone, at length the poor child dies, and gives his final groan. Above the cross of stone, a weeping angel flies. A German soldier, bold and brave, hears how this boy died in his grave. He could look danger in the eyes, but now he trembles, moans, and cries. A house for the dead, a house for the dead, he shrieks in a voice full of horror and dread. We do not want from fickle chance to be buried in a state of trance. Yes, 'tis a house for the dead that we crave, to save us for dying within the grave. And if you are not blind or quite off your head, 'tis silly to bury us before we are dead. Frederick Kempner's parents were deeply ashamed of their daughter's dubious literary fame, fearful that not only the Kempner name or Kempner family, but the entire Jewish community in Germany might become a laughingstock after these ludicrous poems had become popular. They secretly purchased what remained of the first edition and destroyed it. The publishers issued new editions, however, and Frederick's fame was such that the family could not keep up with the demand from the readers hungry for amusement. In 1903, the eighth edition was published, but by that time, even the naive Frederique had come to know the true reasons for her fame. In a furious preface, she swore that the day would come when her name would be etched in bronze and the true literary value of her poems fully appreciated. The following year, she died of a stroke. In her will, she requested that an electrical apparatus be installed in her coffin so that she could ring for help if she woke up. But this device proved superfluous since she was cremated. Woo! One of Frederick Kempner's contemporaries, the famous Swiss poet Gottfried Keller, completely outdid even her. He devoted an entire cycle of poems to describing the thoughts of a man buried alive in a coffin under 6 feet of earth. It is a beautiful, although macabre poem, and contains some haunting images. The prematurely buried man feels the pine boards of his coffin, and they remind him first of a ship's mast, and then of the first pine tree he ever saw, a Christmas tree ablaze with candles. He discovers that he has eaten a rose that had been put between his hands before the coffin lid was screwed shut, and is sad that he will never know whether it was a white or a red rose. The final image is of a surging sea of life, a vast landscape with no horizon. For the prematurely buried man whose time is rapidly running out, eternity is captured in a single intake of breath. The Swiss composer Othmar Schock made Keller's Lebendig Begraben into a 45-minute long orchestral song cycle, which begins with a realistic impression of earth falling down onto a coffin lid. There are quite a few examples of well-known literary men who feared a premature burial. The famous German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer freely admitted to a fear of premature interment and stipulated that his corpse rest above ground 5 full days before burial. The Austrian writer Johann Nepomuk Nestroy was much more elaborate in his precautions. In his will, he declared that the risk of premature burial was the only thing he feared in his present situation, and that his studies of the literature on this subject had taught him that the doctors could not be relied on to distinguish dead people from living ones. His body was to be kept in an open coffin for 2 days in a waiting mortuary with a signaling apparatus that would herald any signs of returning life. Even after burial, the coffin lid was not to be nailed shut. Russia's most famous example of the 19th century fear of premature burial is the author Nikolai Gogol. In a letter to a friend, He wrote that it was amazing that, as he had read in a book, the human organism could exist in a state of trance for long periods of time, and that the individual could see, hear, and feel, but not move, speak, or do anything to prevent being prematurely buried. In his will, Gogol specified that he not be buried until there were clear signs of putrefaction, and until it was ascertained that there was no heartbeat and no peripheral pulsations. It has been speculated that, in spite of his precautions, Gogol was really buried alive. When his coffin was exhumed many years after his death in 1852, it was seen that the body was lying on its side, according to a German author. There was only one explanation for this. Gogol had awakened in the coffin, and a terrible struggle had occurred. An Irish master of the horror story, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, a contemporary of Poe's, used the premature burial theme in his short story, The Room in the Dragon Volant. A wealthy young English man falls afoul of a band of French impostors. They plan to steal his money and dupe him to drink poison. He falls into a deep trance, is captured, and put into a coffin. Although paralyzed, he remains conscious and can hear how the rogues plan to have him buried alive. In the nick of time, they are stopped by the French police. Marie Corelli was one of the most celebrated popular novelists of the late 19th century. Her books were massive bestsellers, and even Queen Victoria admitted to being an avid reader of them. Corelli's first book, A Romance of Two Worlds, was an immediate success. To follow it up, she quickly wrote another high strung melodrama, tentatively titled Buried Alive. It was allegedly based on true events during the plague in Naples of 1884. The book's hero is Count Fabio Romani, a wealthy young Neapolitan nobleman. When he tries to help the poor during a cholera epidemic, he himself catches the disease and is declared dead. The reader of this book will not be surprised at what happens next. Romani awakes in his coffin, which has been put in the family vault. But what was this that hindered my breathing? Air, air. I must have air. I put up my hands. Horror. They struck against the hard opposing substance close above me, quick as lightning. Then the truth flashed through my mind. I had been buried alive. This wooden prison that enclosed me was a coffin. With remarkable resilience for a cholera victim who has withstood several days of premature burial, Romani breaks out of his coffin with the strength and frenzy of an infuriated tiger. After tearing a vampire bat from his neck, he wades through the piles of putrefying corpses in search of a way out. The Romani family vault has a rich and varied fauna, and the wretched count has to watch out for its many venomous snakes and reptiles. Suddenly, a huge owl swoops down at him, but the sturdy nobleman vanquishes it after a desperate fight. By a coincidence that stretches the imagination even of the reader of a cheap Victorian sensation novel, he then finds not only a convenient exit from the tomb, but also a huge treasure deposited there by a gang of robbers. When the resuscitated Count returns home, he comes upon his faithless wife in the arms of an old friend of his, Signor Guido Ferrari. It is apparent from their conversation that she never loved Count Fabio and deceived him with Guido even before his supposed death. Count Fabio Romani vows revenge. His appearance is totally changed by his ordeal in the tomb. His face is pale and haggard, and his hair became white overnight. The wicked Guido and the faithless wife do not recognize the resurrected count when he is reintroduced to them under an assumed name. Count Fabio then seduces his own wife and gloatingly tells Guido what has happened in the resulting duel. He shoots the rival dead. In the highly charged final scene, Count Fabio takes his wife into the family mausoleum and tells her his real identity and that he was buried alive. She tries to stab him but is crushed to death under a huge boulder that conveniently falls from the roof of the vault. Corelli's publisher, George Bentley, was quite impressed with this overblown melodrama, although he insisted on changing its title to Vendetta. Published in 1886, it caused quite a stir. The Prince of Wales requested a copy. It remains one of Corelli's better known novels. We're going to stop here. That's 18 pages in. And how many are left? 15? Probably should stop. I'm almost at 48 minutes. Let's see if there's another break. Yeah, we can go to this page. The sensation novelist Wilkie Collins's work has withstood the test of time much better than Marie Corelli's. He was a writer of considerable talent and imagination, and his books are still widely read. Collins was a nervous, high-strung man and addicted to opium. It is not surprising that he was also yet another victim of the premature burial scare. He particularly distrusted continental doctors, as did not a few of his xenophobic countrymen. When staying at a hotel abroad, he always put a note on the bedroom mirror saying that in the case of his presumed death, he should not be buried until a competent English doctor had been consulted. Collins very likely visited the waiting mortuary in Frankfurt, which he used as a setting, the setting of his 1880 novel, Jezebel's Daughter. This novel is one of his many potboilers, far inferior to his tensely plotted masterpiece, The Woman in White. The use of the German Leichenhaus is supposed to add a frisson of horror to the narrative, but instead has painful hints of the ludicrous. The plot of Jezebel's Daughter is that a certain Mrs. Wagner, or is it Wagner, has died. Her corpse is taken to the dead house for 3 days of supervision. Before the doctor can sign a certificate that putrefaction has occurred, a foundling boy named Jack, to whom the dead lady had shown much kindness, mourns her bitterly and refuses to leave the body, although the doctor shows him the rest of the machinery. Although the doctor shows him the brass thimbles fitted to the... Let me read that sentence over. A foundling boy named Jack, to whom the dead lady had shown much kindness, mourns her bitterly, and refuses to leave the body, although the doctor shows him the brass thimbles fitted to the corpse's fingers, the strings, and the rest of the machinery. Together with the old night watchman of the dead house, Jack later drinks prodigious amounts of brandy, and they sing a song about a former watchman of the Lichen House who went mad as a result of his ghoulish occupation. The moon was shining, cold and bright, in the Frankfurt dead house on New Year's night, and I was the watchman left alone, while the rest to feast and dance were gone. I envied them their lot and cursed my own. Poor me. Unbeknownst to either of these sottish, obstreperous fellows, a certain Madame Fontaine had sneaked into the dead house. She had in fact poisoned Mrs. Wagner, and wants to gloat at the sight of her remains, but not even the steely nerves of this evil hag are able to withstand the sight of the corpse. There, grand and still, lay her murderous work. There, ghostly white on the ground of the black robe, were the rigid hands, topped by the hideous machinery which was to betray them if they trembled under the mysterious return of life. Madame Fontaine seeks comfort with Jack and his inebriated companion, but they jeer and deride her. They sing. Any company's better than none, I said. If I can't have the living, I'll have the dead. In one terrific moment more, the corpse bell rang at each cell door. While they are singing and reveling, the bell in Mrs. Wagner's cell rings time after time. But only Madame Fontaine hears it, since the other two are too drunk. At long last, the apparently dead lady manages to make her resurrection known. and Jack is reunited with his mistress. Madame Fontaine, who inadvertently drinks a glass of her own poison, dies in the agonies considered suitable for a Victorian villainess. The Lichen House in Munich is the scene for A Dying Man's Confession, one of Mark Twain's short stories. The family of a German immigrant in the United States is attacked by two robbers who kill his wife and child. One of the robbers has no right thumb. The immigrant swears vengeance on them and manages to track one of them down and kill him. He then returns to his own country and becomes night watchman at the Munich waiting mortuary. One evening, he is horrified when the great corpse bell rings. Down the outside row of shrouded figures, one is sitting upright and wagging his head from side to side. The German recognizes him as the surviving robber, the one who actually murdered his wife and child. He deliberately withholds the cordials in the Lichen House pharmacy and himself drinks the brandy intended for the living corpse, while taunting his helpless shrouded enemy and watching him die. The grim conclusion: it is believed that in all these 18 years that have elapsed since the institution of the corpse watch, no shrouded occupant of the Bavarian dead houses has ever rung its bell. Well, it's a harmless belief. Let it stand at that. And that's going to be all for now, because I'm not reading 15 more pages. That's all, bros. Goodbye.